If you want the chance to win up to $500 in Bass Pro Shops gift cards, stay tuned. It's easy being a bad guy. That may have been the most disturbing thing Richard Marcinko ever said, because the Navy had spent much of his career rewarding him for crossing lines. Tactical lines, bureaucratic lines, sometimes lines nobody else even realized could be crossed. The Navy would repeatedly discover how dangerously useful that could be. Eventually, they would give Marcinko one of the strangest assignments in the American military. His job would be to attack his own country. The unit was called Red Cell. From leading SEALs through the jungles of Vietnam to building one of America's most elite special operations units, Richard Marcinko made a career out of staying one step ahead of his opponents. Metal Hunter lets you put those same instincts to the test with a chance to win up to $30,000 in Bass Pro Shops gift cards while you're at it. Metal Hunter is a free military shooting game for iOS and Android, built around three-way player versus player duels, in which you won't be able to rely on auto-aim to beat your opponent. Timing, anticipation, and precision with stationary weapons decide who takes the silver pot. You can fight across 9 historical battlefields, which you'll probably recognize from our videos at DARKDOCS, including Pearl Harbor, Warsaw, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. And as you move forward, you can collect gunner cards, upgrade your weapons, build your haven, and climb the leagues and club rankings. Don't miss this window. Right now, there are over $30,000 in Bass Pro Shops gift cards ready to be won. Unlock Location 2 for your first giveaway spin, then reach Locations 4, 7, and 9 for more. Copy your player ID, visit mh-challenge.com, and spin the wheel to reveal your prize. Download Metal Hunter today for free. Use code DARKDOCS for your exclusive welcome kit, and enter before September 13th. And let us know what you got in the comments. It was in May 1967 that Ensign Richard Marcinko gave the Navy their first real reason to know his name. He led a 7-man squad on a patrol onto a Mekong Delta island known as Iloilo Han, which was thick with foliage and knee-deep mud. After struggling through the challenging terrain for 2 hours, they discovered a Viet Cong medical station, hidden and heavily booby-trapped. One by one, Marcinko and his men cleared the mines by hand, as quietly as possible, so as not to alert whoever was still inside. With the mines disabled, the SEALs launched a brutal attack that took the enemy completely by surprise. Within minutes, Marcinko's squad had eliminated 5 Viet Cong fighters and seized rifles, documents, notebooks, and medical supplies before the position could be reinforced. As Marcinko led his men back toward the water with their haul, destroying enemy sampans as they went, suddenly they began taking sniper fire from the tree line. Marcinko called in mortars from a support boat to silence the enemy marksmen before he could slow them down. The Navy would later call it the most successful SEAL operation in the entire Mekong Delta. After his first tour, the Navy sent him on a recruiting tour of East Coast ports. A reporter from a men's magazine profiled him for the trip and gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Demo Dick, a reference to his supposed penchant for demolitions. The article exaggerated his exploits well past what had actually happened, enough that Marcinko later sued the magazine for libel. But by then, it was too late. He was already becoming more myth than man. The stories from the article even found their way to the ears of the Viet Cong, who responded by putting a price on his head: 50,000 piastres. By his second tour, Richard Marcinko had a reputation for going places no SEAL had gone before, and for making sure the Viet Cong knew exactly who'd been there. He'd taken SEAL patrols farther inland along canals and waterways than anyone had previously operated. To scout one of the most dangerous of these routes, he once had himself march down the canal in restraints, flanked by his own South Vietnamese allies dressed as prison guards. A Navy SEAL disguised as someone else's prisoner, gathering intelligence on Viet Cong infiltration routes. No conventional patrol could have gotten close enough to see. When his patrols did find the enemy, they made sure word got back. Before withdrawing, his men would leave a stripe of their own camouflage face paint on the bodies of fallen enemy fighters. So there'd be no question among the Viet Cong about who was now operating in territory they'd once considered safe. On January 30th, 1968, the coordinated communist attack known as the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam. Viet Cong forces overran the town of Cho Duc, trapping American and South Vietnamese personnel inside the town's church and hospital, including several American nurses and a schoolteacher. Marcinko led his men to assist the Army Special Forces detachment holding the perimeter. What he found when he got there was closer to a siege. Marcinko split his platoon into two groups and led them ashore under fire, straight into a city crawling with Viet Cong. Communications were down. Friendly units were pinned in place, unable to reach the trapped civilians. When one of his own men went down with a serious wound, Marcinko and two others fought 3 blocks through hostile streets just to reach him and get him to medical help. By the time the fighting settled, his platoon had helped free 6 American citizens and 4 Vietnamese government employees, and set up an aid station where the platoon corpsmen treated the wounded, soldiers and civilians alike, side by side. Marcinko would later compare the scene to something out of the 1960s World War II TV show Combat. Men running block to block through a burning city, jeeps mounted with 50 caliber machine guns, bullets ricocheting off every wall. It was his first taste of real urban combat. He would later admit, quote, "I wasn't ready for it." If that was the case, he certainly hadn't shown it. It was already starting to look like a pattern, walking into chaos that most men would have waited out, and walking out of it having changed the outcome. By the end of the 1970s, Richard Marcinko found himself involved with one of the most dangerous rescue missions America had ever attempted. Having spent his post-Vietnam years in a variety of roles, including naval attaché in Cambodia and commander of SEAL Team 2, his old unit. By 1979, he was working on the Pentagon staff. That November, when Iranian militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage, Marcinko was one of 2 Navy representatives on the multi-service task force ordered to plan a rescue. They came up with Operation Eagle Claw. Helicopters would fly Delta Force operators into the Iranian desert under cover of darkness, refuel at a remote rendezvous point, then continue on to Tehran, where the team would storm the embassy compound, free the hostages, and get them to a nearby airfield for evacuation. The mission got underway on the night of April 24th, 1980. It didn't take long to start falling apart. 2 of the helicopters had to drop out en route, brought down by mechanical trouble and a blinding dust storm. Then, one of the helicopters that did make it found its intake filters clogged by fine desert sand, robbing it of the lift it needed to continue. With too few aircraft now able to complete the mission, the raid was aborted before it had truly begun. As the remaining aircraft tried to withdraw, one helicopter collided with a C-130 transport plane on the ground. 8 U.S. servicemen lost their lives. Not a single hostage had been reached. Marcinko would watch the mission come together from the inside. The inter-service rivalries, the divided command, every branch fighting to get a piece of an operation nobody had built to work as one. To him, it wasn't bad luck. It was the predictable result of trying to run a rescue mission by committee. In his own words, the problem was that, quote, "Everybody wants a piece of the action. That's how you defend your budget." Marcinko believed decisions had been made in the interests of keeping the different chains of command happy, rather than focusing on what would deliver results. He'd call it bluntly an embarrassment, one enormous waste, in a mission that should never have failed the way it did. The disaster in the desert became the excuse Washington needed to finally act. A subsequent review, led by retired admirals and generals, concluded that America could no longer fight terrorism with borrowed personnel scraped together for a single mission. It needed a dedicated standing force, trained together, equipped together, ready to move before the next crisis, not during it. The Navy needed someone to build its share of that force from nothing. They picked Marcinko. He was given a matter of months to do it. Marcinko later recalled being told, quote, "Just don't fail." he didn't intend to. The Navy SEALs already had a reputation as something of a renegade force. In Vietnam, they'd almost fought their own war, with little oversight and even less patience for anyone else's rules. In the words of Elliot Cohen, who taught military strategy at the Naval War College, they were, quote, a roughneck outfit, at odds with Navy culture from the outset. Nobody had designed them to be that way. It was simply who they were. But now Marcinko was preparing to build his entire unit from the ground up, explicitly based around that philosophy. He viewed the Navy's usual channels as too bureaucratic and too constrictive, and he had neither the time nor the desire to go through them. Instead, he put together his team according to his own instincts, with little regard for convention. He started with people. Rather than wait for volunteers or recommendations, Marcinko personally interviewed and handpicked roughly 80 men from across the SEAL and underwater demolition team community, drawing on years of knowing exactly who among his old teammates could actually shoot, dive, and hold up under pressure. He wasn't interested in natural talent alone. Some operators were naturally gifted, he'd say, but the ones he valued most were what he called his sled dogs, the ones who worked harder because they had to. They trained hard every single day, with no let-up, so that when a real crisis came, it barely registered as different. It was just another day. He wasn't always popular. He later admitted he had all the bedside manner of a battlefield surgeon, but he was able to build a roster of men who were highly skilled, intensely loyal, and often had an outsider quality. In Marcinko's words, quote, "We were social misfits. We set it up like a mafioso, a band, a brotherhood." Even though the Navy only had 2 SEAL teams at the time, Marcinko called his new unit SEAL Team 6. It was a deliberate move. He reasoned that Soviet intelligence would assume the US had 3 more SEAL units they didn't know about. It cost nothing and bought a small, useful lie about American capability. Previously, the kind of trade a conventional command structure would never have approved, and never needed to. Navy planners originally wanted the new team based at Fort Bragg, alongside the Army's Delta Force. Marcinko refused and rewrote the plan himself, insisting the unit stay near Virginia Beach, close to the ocean his men would actually need to operate in, and close to the existing SEAL infrastructure that could keep them supplied and trained. It was a small bureaucratic battle, but a telling one. Everything about this unit was going to be built around what the mission actually required, not what was administratively convenient. When it came to actually running the team, Marcinko was no less insistent on doing things his own way. Standard Navy procedure kept weapons, parachutes, and dive gear in shared lockers, issued out before each operation, which meant that if something failed, no individual could be held responsible for it. Marcinko scrapped that entirely. Every operator got his own weapon, his own parachute, his own gear, stored in his own personal locker. If it didn't work, there was no one else to blame. Yet he also gave his men far more autonomy than in standard Navy units. Rather than forcing them to rely on standard issue equipment, he would encourage them to request and develop their own, and provide the budget for them to do so. As SEAL Team 6 member Frank Phillips later put it, quote, "He provided the purse, we provided the wants." He let his men grow their hair out and dress like civilians, on the theory that a team meant to operate undetected shouldn't look like it had just stepped off a military base. Every piece of it was built around the same idea: give the men what they actually needed to do the job, and strip away whatever existed only to satisfy the paperwork. It came together fast. The unit was formally commissioned on September 1st, 1980. By New Year's Eve, it was operational. Marcinko's maverick, all-or-nothing approach to building and running SEAL Team 6 also extended to its culture. According to journalist Matthew Cole, who spent years investigating the unit, Marcinko treated a man's ability to drink as a genuine screening tool. If a candidate couldn't keep pace with him at a bar, in Marcinko's mind, he had no business being on the team. But being able to drink was never an excuse for being caught off guard. After one especially brutal stretch of training, 7 or 8 weeks of nearly round-the-clock work, his men were, in Frank Phillips' words, quote, beat down to nothing. When it finally ended, the entire team decided to celebrate, heading into town for a night of drinking that turned into a blowout. Some men didn't even make it home. Phillips remembers finding grown SEALs passed out under their own cars. Suddenly, at 3 a.m., Marcinko called a full recall. Gear packed, ready to move, no excuses. It wasn't punishment for its own sake. According to Phillips, Marcinko made his point plainly. If this was the life they wanted, they better get their priorities straight, and never let a night like that happen again. They had to learn to be ready at all times, no exceptions. It was a philosophy that forged one of the most effective units in the U.S. military, and one that ran, in practice, on Marcinko's word alone. However, that would change in January 1983, when the Navy's rotation policy meant he had to hand command of SEAL Team 6 to Captain Robert Gormley, a fellow Vietnam veteran who could barely have been more different from Marcinko. He was quiet where Marcinko was loud, content to work within the chain of command, where Marcinko had spent a career testing its limits. Gormley would later write that while he commanded the unit, Marcinko, who'd gone back to working on the Pentagon staff, did his best to discredit him among the senior officers he answered to. Whether it was a professional opinion, a personal vendetta, or simply an inability to accept that the team he'd built from scratch no longer belonged to him, is unclear. Yet it wouldn't be long before he had a new project to lead. In early 1984, Vice Admiral James Ace Lyons called Marcinko into his office with a problem. Nobody in the Navy actually knew how vulnerable its own bases were to terrorist attacks, because nobody had ever tested them properly. Lyons wanted Marcinko to put together a unit that could. Marcinko called it Red Cell, and staffed it almost entirely with men he already trusted. 13 of the 14 founding members came straight from SEAL Team 6. Their mission was to hit American military installations as realistically as possible, and expose the Navy's own vulnerabilities before someone more dangerous did. In order to provide a more accurate impression of what a terrorist cell might be able to do, Marcinko deliberately capped his own team's capabilities. He didn't want them to attack with the sophistication of elite American operators. By his own description, quote, "We probably never went any higher than what a good second-story man does in New York City." Yet, even with their self-imposed handicap, Red Cell was able to wreak havoc on several U.S. bases. At Naval Station Norfolk, they staged a full dress rehearsal, right down to a fictional identity, the Victoria Liberation Front, and a kidnapping of the base commander to prove how easily it could be done. At the submarine base in New London, Connecticut, Marcinko and his men floated in on scraps of driftwood, using the flotsam to disguise themselves as they slipped past security completely unnoticed, and planted mock explosives inside the control room of a nuclear attack submarine. At Naval Station Point Mugu, over Labor Day weekend, Marcinko and his men discovered Air Force One parked on the tarmac while President Reagan vacationed nearby, and quote-unquote destroyed it, leaving a stolen weapons carrier loaded with dummy bombs beside the aircraft before anyone noticed they'd been there at all. The exercises weren't just theater. They exposed a real structural flaw running through Navy security. On any given base, departments like aviation and medical services didn't answer to the base commander at all. They reported up their own separate chains of command, halfway around the world. In a real attack, the man supposedly in charge of defending the base wouldn't have the authority to actually coordinate one. Marcinko had a phrase he used constantly to explain what Red Cell proved, again and again, quote, "It's easy being a bad guy. Security, by its nature, waits for something to happen. All Red Cell had to do was be patient, be creative, and go where no one had bothered to look." However, the same qualities that made Red Cell so effective, the autonomy, the total trust Marcinko placed in his own men, the near total absence of anyone looking over their shoulder, had no real check built into them. Sooner or later, that was going to go wrong somewhere. In March 1986, Red Cell arrived at Naval Weapons Station Seal Beach in Orange County, California, to run another security exercise. This time, something was different from the start. Base security had been briefed in advance, as usual, but on this occasion, they refused Red Cell's request to use a warehouse on the base as an operations center. Marcinko and his men took it personally. Their target was Ron Sheridan, the base's civilian site security officer. At 3 a.m. on March 20th, Sheridan's phone rang, ordering him into work. He suspected a hoax, but got dressed and headed out anyway. Outside, a man brandishing a gun and flashing a badge, Frank Phillips, who'd followed Marcinko from SEAL Team 6 to Red Cell, ordered him into a car. They took him to a motel in Costa Mesa. For hours, nothing happened. Sheridan sat with his captors, watching television, asking repeatedly to go home, being refused every time. Then, in the afternoon, a phone call came in. Reportedly, the voice on the other end told the Red Cell men to rough Sheridan up. Sheridan was stripped, beaten, and held upside down, though none of it was really an interrogation, since nobody was asking anything they actually needed answered. The ordeal lasted for nearly 30 hours. Sheridan was a civilian. He'd never signed up to be treated like a captured enemy combatant, and Navy investigators would later be told that the only real limit anyone had placed on the exercise was that it shouldn't draw blood or break bones. Sheridan sued the federal government and named Marcinko personally as a defendant. Marcinko had already been under informal watch by the Navy since 1983 as the result of an unrelated report. Now, facing real scrutiny, he told naval investigators the Seal Beach incident never happened. But the investigators already had the tapes. Caught, Marcinko didn't dig in and protect his men the way he always had. He cut a deal. Immunity from Sheridan's lawsuit in exchange for testimony pointing the blame at Essex Corporation, the civilian contractor that filmed Red Cell's exercises. His own men were stunned. As one former SEAL put it afterward, quote, "We all thought it would be like the SEAL Team 6 days, when Dick made all the trouble go away. This time, he simply let someone else take the fall." Essex didn't take it quietly either. Martin Every, the man who'd run Essex's video operation for years, capturing Red Cell's exploits on film, couldn't understand why he and his company had been the ones thrown to the wolves. He later said, quote, "I don't know why he picked on Essex. We made him look awfully good." Marcinko walked away from the Seal Beach case with little more than a formal reprimand. But soon enough, he had another legal issue to deal with. A separate investigation, digging into Marcinko's finances since he'd left SEAL Team 6, turned up 2 more schemes. Falsified travel expense claims for lodging that was never actually paid for, and a padded $346,000 contract for stun grenades from a company that never delivered a working product. In January 1990, Marcinko was convicted of conspiracy to defraud the government. He was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison. In the end, Marcinko served 15 months of his sentence. If anyone thought the scandals of the 1980s would see him prefer to quietly disappear from the public eye, they clearly didn't know Richard Marcinko. As far as he was concerned, he had nothing to be ashamed of. He insisted he'd been the victim of a witch hunt, that he'd embarrassed too many admirals by proving they couldn't stop him, and that the powers that be had come after him as revenge. Instead of fading away, he became a best-selling author, turning his own story into Rogue Warrior, then into over a dozen more books that drifted over the years from memoir into pulpy action fiction, with Marcinko cast as the larger-than-life protagonist of his own increasingly implausible adventures. New York Times critic David Murray wrote that he, quote, "comes across as less the genuine warrior than a comic book superhero who makes Arnold Schwarzenegger look like little Lord Fauntleroy." Yet in real life, Marcinko was anything but one-dimensional, a man whose attributes were often the same as his flaws. Even after his passing on Christmas Day 2021, at age 81, he remains one of the most celebrated figures in special operations history, and one of the most controversial. To some, he's a legend. To others, a con man. Maybe he is simply proof that the two aren't always as far apart as anyone would like to believe. Thank you to Metal Hunter for sponsoring today's video. Download Metal Hunter for free. Use our code DARKDOCS for your welcome kit and enter the $30,000 Bass Pro Shops giveaway before it ends on September 13th. Don't forget to tell us what you won.